we go. Okay. They don't, sorry for the pause. Apparently they do not hear the announcements that I hear on this side. So I was being polite and letting the lady from Join Me speak. So welcome to TrackLight's webinar today. We have Melissa who is going to talk to us about leveraging assets. And I just wanted to say welcome to Melissa. And this is our second year of webinars here at TrackLight, so we're excited about it. These slides will be available on SlideShare afterwards and under TrackLight. And then we also will have the audio from this and the slides available on our website under resources. So first of all, I should have said who I am. I'm Mary Judden, and I'm the founder and CEO of TrackLight. And Melissa, right before we get to her slides in a little bit more detail. So in order to leverage your assets, you have to first of all know what your assets are. So the assets that we're going to talk about today are mainly your intangibles. And for those of you who are entrepreneurs, this is what our world looks like. And it's a little scary when you first start up. You don't know exactly which way is up. There's a lot of things going on. And intellectual property is something that is generally misunderstood and people are afraid of it. So capturing your innovation as you go along can be really, really difficult. And we want people to get started on the right foot, because your intellectual property for startups is often more than 90% of the value of your company. So to use TrackLight as an example, we're a software company. We've been around now for over 3 years. We're in version 3 of our software. As I mentioned, we have reams of content, webinars. We have a blog, which Emily from our team makes sure that we have a blog every day. We've created a lot of assets, except none of those assets are anything that you can touch. The company itself, if you looked at our traditional balance sheet, which would have your financial assets on it, it unfortunately doesn't have very much other than some debt. If you just looked at our hard assets, you would think that TrackLight isn't worth very much at all. But we believe it's worth quite a bit. And most companies that are startups have good valuations. They just don't have hard assets. So because when you start is the right time to figure out your strategy for this intellectual property, we're going to quickly review what is the intellectual property that I keep going on about, and then we're going to give a few examples of the misconceptions, and then I'm going to turn it over to Melissa to talk about some of the common mistakes that people make and what they can do to better leverage their assets. Oh, and then the cute little, there we go. So what is intellectual property? These are the 4 categories. My disclaimer is that any speaking that I do advice, I'll leave Melissa to do her own disclaimer. Melissa is an attorney. I am not. I have a law degree. I am not a practicing attorney. So nothing I'm going to say today is legal advice. Okay, so the best example that I can think of as a trade secret is Coca-Cola. And the recipe for Coca-Cola has been a trade secret for over 100 years. Without, with patent protection, it would have been in the public domain, and people would have been able to, replicate it over 100 years ago. So what Coke decided to do instead was keep it a secret. There's very few people in the world that know the entire process, so they've split it into pieces. This type of trade secret is pretty extreme. People on the call can be thinking, well, it doesn't apply to me. But simple things like your customer list is your trade secret. If you think about how hard you work to get your contacts or special suppliers, depending on what industry you're in, those are secrets. Those are things that you need to protect. And they have value, like Melissa will talk about. So trade secrets are the unsung heroes. Not to say that patents are a bad thing. A patent, utility patent on something like the pieces in the car in the picture is a great thing. You know, design patents on something like the Coca-Cola bottle, very good. You know, people who are going into industries where you have to have a patent, biomedical, some of the other industries, very, very important. But what a patent is truly is the right to exclude others from whatever you're doing or having the same Coca-Cola design to their bottle. So it doesn't give you the right to create something. It just gives you the right to stop others from making what you have your patent. So for startups, it's often a little bit of a double-edged sword. Great to get a patent, but if you ever actually had to enforce it, it would be difficult because patent litigation is very, very expensive. So the other two types of IP, we have copyright and we have trademark or service mark. So copyright is something like Coca-Cola's website, if you look at it, or your own website. The words or drawings as they're expressed, if they're original works, so I'm drawing something, which I can promise you won't be that good, but if I'm drawing something out, that will be protected as soon as I put it down on paper and I can put a C on it. If I want it registered so that I could actually do something about it if someone took it, then I'd have to take the additional step of registering it at the U.S. Copyright Office. Trademark is different. So a trademark it's a mark on a brand or a mark on a product or a service that the whole idea behind it is to assure the consumer of the quality. So when I open the bottle of Coca-Cola, I'm not going to get Pepsi. I'm not going to get store brand Coke coming out of there. It's going to be, it's my guarantee to me as a consumer. So the TM is something that you're allowed to put on there once you start using, you're saying like, this is my mark. The R can only ever be used when you've actually registered it with the United States Patent and Trademark Office. So those are the different items. The reason the Fig Newmans is up there is because I bought those thinking Fig Newtons for my 16-year-old who's now an even crankier 17-year-old. And so he was like, what? This is not what I asked you to buy. So I would contend that Fig Newmans confuse the consumer as opposed to Fig Newtons. Now, being the geek that I am, the IP geek, or just general geek that I am, I looked up how, you know, registered trademark. Interestingly, even though if you look very closely, you can see a TM, it's actually a registered trademark, and they received it in 1997, I believe, whereas Fig Newtons was like 1927. I think the reason that they were able to get this registered, even though it's a bit confusing, is because all the proceeds from a Newman's brand goes to charity. So that might be why. So a couple of conceptions. Okay, this is the biggest one that we get. I hear people all the time saying, oh, I just have a website, I don't have any software, or I just have a website, I don't have any product, you know, I'm just a travel agent, or I'm just a fill-in, I don't have any IP. Everyone has IP. It's impossible to have a company or a product without having IP. And Melissa's going to get into the issue of you could have just a product and no company, so I won't talk about that. It is something that is super important for inventors because you want to make sure before you're going out to the market that you understand exactly that what you have. And for inventors, they often focus on patents and then miss the when it comes to copyright and trademark and often trade secret. So although with trade secrets, there's no registration, because clearly if you registered your secret, it wouldn't be secret anymore. They are not simple to protect. You still have to take steps, and those are different state to state, but you still have to take some steps, and that's something probably talk to an attorney about what those steps are. They're not onerous. There's no actual outlay of cash to the government. have to take reasonable steps to guard your secrets. This is one of my favorites, is this idea that if there's no C on it, it's just fair game. And so Emily and Michael, who are here with me, will be bored of my example, but it's like if you saw and there's like 5 bikes there and 4 of them have locks and the 5th one doesn't, it doesn't mean that you can just take that. That's the same thing. Unless you actually created whatever it is, music, a photo, writing, unless you created it, you can't use it unless you understand what the permissions are behind it. And just because it doesn't have a C on it doesn't mean it's fair game. And there is no 1 second rule when it comes to music or 3 rule when it comes to music. You simply cannot use other people's works of art. And you can't copyright an idea. An idea is still in your head. So once you put it down on paper, then you can certainly copyright it. And the whole issue of domain names and trademarks. This is where, especially in today's internet world, where .co, fill in the blank, this is becoming a bigger problem, because if I run out and get, Coca-Cola Button, I'm going to have a problem with Coca-Cola, in that doesn't give me the right to use the name Coca-Cola. It's just because I have a domain name, it doesn't give me any trademark or naming rights. So you have to do that separately. And we already covered patents mean the right to sell or make. They don't. They mean the right to exclude. And then this is the one where we've seen a lot of very sad stories. Just because you pay for somebody to create something, and Melissa's background is with creative individuals and protecting creative businesses. So this is really, really important for both sides of that. You understand the contracts that you go into, because if it's not spelled out in a contract with an independent contract who owns the rights to the intellectual property at the end, even if you pay for it, you might not own it. Just a brief overview. If you are an inventor, it's really, really important to understand that you can't just get a patent in the U.S. It doesn't extend outside the U.S. And if you get a patent, multiple people on the patent, you all have your own individual rights to exploit or sell that. So you need to make sure that if there's more than just you, or even if it's just you, that you make sure that the company owns the rights. So that's the 3rd bullet, the proper assignment of IP rights. So if I invented something with Emily, and Emily thought, oh, this is great, we're just all going to have our names on the patent, and then Emily runs off and makes a deal, she would. If Emily ran off and made her own deal, then she's allowed to do that. I could run off and make a deal too. So it could end up being very dysfunctional, and you could have competing products, and you'll end up with a lawsuit. So the easiest thing from the very beginning is that when you're filing your patents, make sure that you are assigning the rights to that patent, the whole bundle of rights, as they call it. Make sure you're assigning it over to a company or an entity, and Melissa's going to talk about the importance of having an entity. And finally, on this issue, I just wanted to mention that if you're in the early stages of your business, that if you're the employee of another company, like let's say you work for Google or you work for Cola, these are some of the companies where if you invent something, they might own it. The company might own it. So you need to be very, very careful. One of the first steps you need to do is read your employment agreement before you start working on your project. And a good rule of thumb, don't work on your project during the work hours when you're working for somebody else. But you definitely need depending on what you're doing, you might even need your attorney to reread your employment agreement. Oh, this thing is going to move across. Okay, so when you're getting together, when you're getting ready to go to your attorney, or you're getting ready to identify what you have as intellectual property, This is just a quick checklist chart, and this is what TrackLight software actually does. We have a self-guided questionnaire that helps through and create your IP strategy. But these are some of the things that you need to think about, whether you have employees and contractors. Most people know, okay, I know what my idea is, I know what my products are, but also give some thought to, do you have no secrets that might be very valuable? Because the idea is, before you can leverage all your intangibles, you need to identify, and then you need to protect. I'm not going to go through this slide in detail, other than to let you know that get what you pay for. So if you decide that you're going to do your own provisional patents and your own trademarks, be prepared to run into problems unless you're a very experienced inventor who's done patents before, because or trademarks. Because trademarks, there's no do-overs. If you make mistakes when you're filing them, you'll end up having to refile them. Copyright is something that we tell people, if it's simple copyright, go ahead and do it yourself. So my last two comments around the flip side of intellectual property protection, which is infringement. So when you're out there doing your blogs, creating your marketing content, whatever you're doing, please make sure that you adhere to the bike rule. You do not just grab stuff off of the internet. We're just in the process of making this invitation for an event that we're doing in New York, and we're doing it with a couple of other people. We found out that in order to use, once the invitation was designed by our wonderful creative director, Tara, we found out that we actually had to embed to the dryicons.com, which was a lovely icon, but we had to embed the link into the invitation in order to use it properly. So there's no way that we wanted to be paying any kind of fine. So Tara, good, she read it, and we had to redo it with a link in it actually today. So you do need to be careful, because it is not a defense. And Creative Commons, I'm sure Melissa can talk about this more, but Creative Commons is a great place to look at the different licenses. And you do, sadly though, have to read these licenses. There's a variety of uses, and it's like open source code versus the different licenses using an image. It's all the same. It's all the same in terms of needing to read what the license says, because you'd be amazed. It will say some crazy things. We've heard things like, this is to be good, used for only good, not evil, which I'm not quite sure what the legal definition of that is, but that's in some open source code. That you want to look to see that you can use it for commercial use. And that's really important, because just saying, hey, I just have a blog, well, your blog's on your website's for commercial use, so you need to make sure that you're on the side of caution. So that's it for me, and now I'm going to turn it over to Melissa, and let me just say a few words about Melissa. She is the owner and principal attorney. She has a boutique firm, which is in some really cool places. It's in California, Washington, and Oregon, so very West Coast, very nice. And Melissa today to us from Portland. She specializes in working with creative folks. I think, since I work with both creative and non-creative folks, I think it's a great advantage to have an also creative person, because the brain process is not necessarily the same between the linear thinkers and the creative ones. So she practices something like that she likes to call holistic law. So I'm interested to hear more about what that's. So take it away, Melissa.
Thank you, Mary. That was such a wonderful overview. My disclaimer is that I am not here to provide any legal advice. This is for educational purposes only, and any images that are included in these slides, of course, fall under fair use, which is an affirmative defense under copyright. So my personal definition of licensing is the life cycle of contracts regarding intellectual property, which Mary just reviewed very, very well, between businesses. So essentially, there's an overlay here between business and IP, and that's largely what I practice. I'm a business lawyer with an extensive background and experience with intellectual property. As Mary alluded to earlier, something that would be considered potentially simple, like copyright, is not simple at all. There are lots of moving parts. A lot of attorneys do not understand intellectual property. Unfortunately, a lot of judges do not understand intellectual property. And if you don't take the time and the care to really have a strategic plan, think it through with a business attorney who understands those rights, you could be getting into some expensive and draining experiences later. So I will be reviewing some of the biggest mistakes that I've seen in both the business realm and then in the intellectual property or the licensing realm, and then go into an example. So I cannot flip through on my slides here for some reason. Oh, there we go. So I also have created a Facebook page called the Tao of Business Law. It is something that I invite everybody to look up on Facebook and join. This is just a very easy, in common language talk, review in blurbs of elements of both business law and intellectual property law. So my Taoist interpretation of business law can be distilled into this one sentence. It's someone doing something for someone else in exchange for something. And that in exchange is actually a very critical part of any kind of contract or transaction. That has a legal term. It's called consideration. You can basically remember this little motto, you don't get something for nothing, or there is no free lunch. And that is very true when you're talking about business or licensing. So even if you don't write a license down, if there are two people that are exchanging something and there's an exchange of value, that may very well constitute a contract. So you can have an oral agreement without writing something down, and that definitely extends to intellectual property as well. So the first question here is, are you in business? What is your commitment? What are your finances? And oftentimes, even though there are startups that I work with, I like to think about what are you planning to do to get out of your business? What are your goals? I like to have a very real conversation with my clients here, and this is part of that holistic law. What does your life look like as a person, as an individual, as a family member, and what is your commitment? If you're not really fully committed to your business or you have a fairly low commitment level, are you going to follow this through? Incidentally, from the IRS perspective, if you are not generating positive income after 3 years, you're not considered a business. You're considered a hobbyist. So you want to think about, are we going to kind of get into the game? And if so, it's a good idea to incorporate. So again, I'm having some difficulties thank you. So the number one business mistake that I see is a failure to incorporate. And you can think about incorporation as almost like blowing this massive bubble. It's an invisible bubble around your assets. When I say your assets, I mean, do you own a home? Do you own a car? Do you have a savings plan? Do you have a savings account for your children's education? The government does not want anybody to risk all of their hard work and all of their assets in order to get into business. They want to encourage entrepreneurship and business. That's good for everybody. That generates tax revenue. So they have created incorporation. This is a very important first step. If you ever do end up in some sort of a litigation, you want to make sure that any judgment that may be rendered against you does not extend to your personal assets. Of course, there are various tax benefits as well that I won't get into, but I see this being a big mistake. You can really risk more than you were initially planning on if you don't incorporate and you just kind of move forward in a business and it takes off and then you're the subject to litigation. The second biggest business mistake that I see is that people incorporate improperly or they pick the wrong entity. So some of the things to think about are how many people are joining together in your business. If it's more than just one, then you probably need to have some sort of agreement between the individuals to think about who's doing what, who's responsible, what are the payouts. If somebody wants to leave, what does that look like? Are you going to accept other people into your endeavor? These agreements are documents that can be generated by a business attorney, and some of them are called a buy-sell agreement. If 2 people or 3 people or more get into a business venture, how are we going to let somebody leave or take new people on? Also, something like the operating agreement has sort of the rules, the playbook on who does what, who's responsible for what areas, how do you judge if they're doing an adequate job. So those are really important to generate, and also kind of part and parcel is to then file them and register your entity adequately. This happens all the time, especially with people who try to register their own businesses. You need to register with the federal government, the IRS, or get an EIN number, which is fairly easy to do. And then also register your business with state and local authorities. You may go through these steps and have done it wrong, in which case you will be considered a default partnership. So an example of a partnership and how it's applied across the board is, let's say there are 2 people that join together in a business venture. All assets and all liabilities are split 50-50. So if that's your agreement, then that's fine. But if it's not your agreement, let's say one person was just going to front some money, say $10,000, and the other person is going to run the entire business and maybe take 95% or 100% of the effort to actually run and maintain the business. This could be a disaster if ultimately a business were to generate a large amount of income and it's determined that all assets are 50-50 split. That may not be what the parties originally intended. On the other hand, if there are, let's say, 2 people who join into a business together and one of them signs a contract and they have the right to do that for $1 million and doesn't tell the other person, both individuals would be on the hook 50-50 for the liabilities if they fail to perform under the terms of that agreement. This does happen often, even with people who are related. There are siblings who get into business, or uncles and aunts, and it just can get fairly ugly. I generally steer people, even startups, to incorporate as an LLC. It's very flexible. There are various taxation benefits, especially when you're beginning. And an LLC is a relatively new business creation within the last 40 years, and it's state-driven. So each state has a different set of criteria of how to operate that LLC. So that's very important, again, to work with a knowledgeable local business attorney. The third business mistake that I see is that, especially in this day and age where we have so much technology that's available to get information out and make businesses, people forget to slow down. So slowing down, as Mary said, especially in the beginning, and coming up with a strategy, or some people say a business plan, of how you're going to market or aggrandize either your products or your services, so important. This is something that I do with all of my clients. This is where that holistic law, again, comes in. And we have some very candid conversations about what are your emotional and energetic commitments? What can you really handle? And if you don't have that capacity to handle a major international endeavor, but you have a really good idea, then there are ways to create opportunities, particularly around licensing of intellectual property, that could maybe work better for you. I encourage my clients to stay flexible, to really allow that brainstorm process to fully flesh out some potential ways of moving forward. Maybe not all of them will generate, but to really open up the possibilities of how you can use both your intellectual property and then maybe if you have a product as well. And ultimately, what I like to do with my clients is to create an endeavor that's going to work for that individual, that they're really going to be happy with. When you start a business, it's almost like having a child. It takes a lot of time and a lot of energy. So I really like to encourage people to be honest about what they want, where they want to go, and then make that happen. I'm going to move on now to licensing mistakes. By far, the number one mistake that I see over and over again is that people will take a license that they found online and use it, and that's a disaster. There are no boilerplate licenses, and I can't say that loud enough or as many times. There are no boilerplate licenses, meaning you can't take somebody else's agreement and have that adequately reflect how you engage in business, what your particular process is. It will not save you time or money to use another company's license, period. The most expensive part of law, by far, is litigation. And with my clients, I try to avoid that at all costs. So do not take somebody else's agreement and think, well, it worked for them, I'll just use it. I kind of think about that as going into a store and getting, a dress and not looking at the size, not trying it on, and just assuming, oh, it looked good on this one person, it'll look good on me. You really need to have a customized agreement that fully addresses how you do business and what you want to achieve. The second biggest licensing mistake that I see is a failure to accurately determine value. So value is a meaningless term, right? So it just doesn't mean anything. So it's so important to do due diligence when you're engaging with another business, to look at their books, how they run their accounting, what their potential is for adequately marketing your product or your intellectual property. Again, working with a business attorney who also has a strong knowledge of intellectual property is so important when you're creating licenses because there are a lot of moving parts. Some of the areas to think about are the scope of media, for example. So if you have a presentation that can be disseminated on the radio, on television, can it be made into an app? Can it be put out on an internet TV? You want to think about what do you have and how can you fully use that intellectual property to generate the largest amount of income. Another area to consider is the scope of geography. Let's say you have a manual or some sort of English language, let's just say even a book. Is that something that you want to disseminate in the U.S.? What about England? What about South Africa? There could be many different ways that you could generate, some call it passive income, by taking what you have and offering that to a variety of different licensees. One way to start to determine value, to try to think about what is the real value of what I have, is you look at the bottom line potential for your licensee. If your licensee had this, how much money could they make given all of the various avenues that they currently have in process for development for advertising? That's a really good way if you can see somehow what their past performance was, then you can project on what future performance could be, and that's a great way to start. And then finally, also, is scope of time. Now, these aren't an exhaustive list of criteria. These are just some things to think about. Do you want to grant somebody a license in perpetuity, meaning forever and ever, or do you want it to just be for a year to see how it goes? The third licensing mistake that I see is that people fail to have a game plan or strategy, and then that strategy is not actually drafted into the agreements. And again, that's that customized element that I really like to get into with my clients. So, for example, if there's a way to take your intellectual property or your process and divide it into phases or milestones, there's a way to gauge whether this partnership or this license is a success. And if it's not, then you can allow for an easy termination. You can even write that into your agreement. For example, if your licensee fails to generate $100,000 within the first year, the agreement will terminate of its own accord. It's very clear. Everybody knows from the get-go what the goal is of the license. And if your licensee fails to hit that, then you can look for other licensees after that point. And then you don't have to go back and try and get out of an agreement or wait. Sometimes people feel like they're held hostage by their agreements because they made it for a very long time, and their licensee is just kind of sitting on it. They're not putting much effort or energy into the endeavor. And that, of course, wastes time, and that does not generate any income for your business. I like to tie payments to the desired outcomes as much as possible. Sometimes people think of that as an incentivizing provision, that if you know through your strategy session how you want or envision this plan to go, you can make those desired outcomes very clear and then make sure that the payments are structured in accordance with them. So with licensing agreements, what we're talking about here is money. You want to make money in this business or with your intellectual property. And there are a lot of different ways to have that payment rendered. These are just a few. There's the upfront lump sum payment that here's my idea or my product, and if you pay me this amount, you can have it for X amount of time. That's really easy, and sometimes that's very helpful, especially after you've performed your due diligence. If you have any thought that maybe this company won't be around in a year, if you're not sure either that their books that you've looked at don't seem to be very strong, or maybe this is a brand new startup and there's just no history to look at. Maybe you want to think, okay, I'll take the money up front and we'll see what happens. You also can have something called a front-loaded payment, which is sort of a hybrid where you get the majority of money up front and then there's a royalty stream that continues over time. There's just a flat royalty, and you can use several of these methods. There's performance-based, which I alluded to before with that incentivizing the feature, and there's something that's often used in entertainment agreements, a cascading or a waterfall provision that looks something like when you generate $100,000, you'll pay a royalty of 10%. When we hit $500,000, it'll be 7%. When we hit $1 million, it'll be 3%, or something like that. Those percentages can go up or down, but those are just some examples. Another thing to keep in mind with payments is that each provision within an agreement, it's sort of like a scale or balance. So if you have a royalty-based payment structure, you absolutely want to include in your agreement some sort of an accounting provision. So an easy example here is if you license an idea and you see that the company seems to be really getting a lot of traction with the product, but your royalty checks are consistent. They don't change. You may want to go in and look at their books. That's really important. Every time you have a royalty-based provision, you really want to make sure you have a strong accounting provision to balance that out. Another area that I see problems coming up is if you have an international agreement, be really clear on how you're going to get payment. That can actually make a big difference. And then finally, there's even the option, and sometimes that needs to be considered, of providing for a bond if necessary after you do your due diligence and maybe you think, I'm not sure this company is going to be around, so if there is any question, we want to make sure that a bond is posted so that I'm not out a lot of money. Something I've addressed very, very superficially before is this idea of exclusive versus non-exclusive. So again, in the context of value, an exclusive right to intellectual property is much more valuable than a non-exclusive. So when you're negotiating with somebody around intellectual property, if they want an exclusive, so nobody else is allowed to create the same IP or do the same process, then you want to make sure that your value assessment is higher. If somebody in the license is permitted to sublicense, you absolutely want to make sure you have a very strong and specific indemnification provision. Indemnification essentially means that you're not going to be burdened with a large and costly legal bill if that licensee sublicenses and there is a problem. So you want to make sure that the licensee will step into your shoes and take over the cost of the litigation, essentially. So again, in this licensing context, my Taoist interpretation is someone doing something for someone else in exchange for something. So this is just one example. I'm a new mother, and I was caught on several occasions where I had to feed my child, and I was completely unprepared, did not have any way to feed her, but there was a vending machine with bottled water. And so I had thought, wow, we really need to make a water bottle nipple attachment for people who are in this situation. And it, sure enough, exists. Green Sprouts had done that, so I should have probably licensed that a lot earlier. So in this process, I would think, okay, who are my potential markets? There are people who are like me, who are inexperienced young parents. There are caretakers, like nannies and babysitters, who may benefit from something like this. There are grandparents or people shopping for moms and maybe even gag gift. Who would I potentially license that to? So any of these companies could have been interested, potentially Gerber, Green Sprouts, Evenflo, and others. This is the brainstorming that I was talking about before. You can even have several different licenses in different countries. So perhaps Gerber would take one country, or if they had a very strong market, or Evenflo in another place. You can divvy up your intellectual property rights to different licensees and create a larger bottom line or revenue base. Again, the performance-based license, you may want to say if you achieve a milestone of $100,000 in revenue by the end of year one, then there's an automatic license renewal for another year. If, on the other hand, there's a failure to hit that mark, there's a termination provision that allows for a 90-day notice by the licensor. It could also terminate of its own accord, but those are some ways to implement these ideas. So I often perform these services for businesses and individuals. I have customized packages that I offer. Some examples of them are example number one, getting this EIN, doing a trademark review, having a consultation, and drafting an agreement, maybe 2 agreements or 3 agreements, and then going over that with my client. These packages are really helpful, and I really enjoy them because those are flat fee structures, so there's not going to be an astronomical legal bill at the end of it. We all know what the cost is up front and what we're going towards. These packages are really helpful for new businesses, by the way, just to get things going in the beginning. So this is my contact information. This is how to find me on the web. And Thank you, Mary. Thank you, everyone else, for joining into this webinar.
Oh, you have a glass of wine. I'm totally jealous.
On occasion, that was my birthday, yes.
Okay, well, there you go. Mine's less. That was me sitting at Tony Shea's desk and with my friend Ruth behind me. Okay, so do we have any questions? I have a few that have come in, but if anyone else wants to type them in, use the little bubble by the, oh,
Not
dear.
there.
Okay.
Hot buttons.
Use the little on the chat, and then just hit at all, and then everyone will see the question. So in the meantime, this is a question for Melissa, which is, how do I get my IP value? What is?
Hello? I'm sorry, I missed that. Can you repeat it, Mary?
Sure. How do I get my IP valued so I know what it is worth?
Again, that depends, and I alluded to it before. It really depends on who your potential purchaser is. So I would say if you're looking for to license your IP and you have some businesses in mind, doing a lot of research into what they have been able to generate for a similar item, a similar market in the past is a great way to start. I really think that's the best way to start to get your head around the value. When you're making a pitch to another company or a business, you want to say, essentially, you're selling your intellectual property, and you want to say, you have all of these various methods. You have research and development, or you have advertising, or you have manufacturing already in place. This is what you can benefit in your bottom line, and then you kind of back that way. And then I guess the other point that I would mention there is, and then thinking about with a business attorney who has a good, very solid understanding of intellectual property, which many don't. It's so important to understand how you're going to divide the rights that you do have. And again, through the presentation, thinking about things like an exclusive license, is that something that's a possibility and that has a higher value than something that is a non-exclusive license that maybe you're going to license to 3 or 4 people at the same time.
Right. And so I should just do a couple plugs for some of our other partners. These are all not legal services. So there's a company called Worthworm, and all our resources are listed on our resource page. Worthworm does pre-money valuation for startup companies, which will include specific IP that you might be valuing just for one licensing agreement, but it will sort of do an overall company. So that's an interesting process to get your IP as part of your assets valued. Foresight Valuation does valuation of IP for licensing agreements, and that's one of the, I think, that you need to balance between. And I'm still an accountant. I was going to say I'm a accountant. I don't practice accounting anymore, but I think when it comes to valuation, it's good to get a blend of the accounting skills or someone who has that kind of venture capitalist background or investment banking background for valuations to help. So those are our two partners that I wanted to give a shout out to. I have another question, and it is regarding business mistake number 1, which was the failure to incorporate. Do you have a resource list on how to start this process, Melissa?
I don't. I address various qualities or items to consider on the Tao of Business Law. But really, again, it depends on who you are and what you're hoping to accomplish, especially if you have multiple people joining together, getting a really good operating agreement pursuant if you try to do an LLC is so important. And again, the LLC rules vary state by state. So one resource list could be to go to the Secretary of State's website and get some information on your particular state. Also, Cornell Law has a vast library that will provide information and oftentimes elements to each state. Now, oftentimes those elements do not include all of the various entities that require registration, like the county registration or for taxation purposes that are required. So it is worth it to consult with a local business attorney, even if it's just a consultation to have them review your plan.
Okay, thanks. And here's what is the advantage to licensing versus selling intellectual property?
So I think both of us could talk to this, Mary, but when you're licensing intellectual property, that creates a potential, some people say it's a passive revenue stream, but it's an option for you to continue to make money over time, depending on how you structure your agreement, based on revenue that's generated. So you're basically giving somebody else an ability to use your idea, to put the effort into the marketing, the advertising, the production, and then you create, you essentially don't have to do much beyond that other than receiving a check, and it provides income over time. A straight sale of intellectual property is also quite useful, but again, that may just render an upfront payment, and it may be less than you really could have made. Also, you retain some amount of control when you own your IP. When you sell it straight away, you really don't know what's going to happen to it. Somebody else is going to own it, and especially for creative individuals, that can be somewhat of a painful process to watch what another company actually does with their idea. And that's not necessarily monetary. That's just a different type of value.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I mean, as a creator, or if you create a company and then you sell your IP, you could end up selling it to somebody who then doesn't use it. And so then you would just see your invention basically shelved, and that would be really demoralizing. As an inventor, you still have the money, but you don't necessarily, you create it for a reason. You created it because it, solves a problem. So, I lean towards the licensing idea because it's leverage, because it's a way of increasing the overall value of your company without having to your actual intellectual property. So it's like basically the idea that you are increasing the value of your entire company asset. So your asset in this case, it's the same thing as if you were a real estate company, you wouldn't sell the buildings, you would lease them. So it's the same kind of process. So I lean towards licensing. That's what we try to do at TrackLight with our software, is in addition to sellers, we also try to license to consumer-facing platforms so that we can then, retain the ownership of our intellectual property.
One more point on that I thought of when you mentioned that, Mary, is if you sell your intellectual property outright, and another company or a person does sit on it, which happens often, and you want to bring it to market in some way, you could actually be infringing on what was originally your idea. So you could be inviting a lawsuit. Companies, go through this all the time. But this is not where you want to be. If you have a passion project and you really want it to see the light of day, you certainly don't want to get into costly litigation over what was originally your idea in the first place.
And the other part of that is that, we had an attorney here for World Intellectual Property Day talking about the fact that you need to get in your licensing agreement provisions around, you don't want to license somebody to just have them sit on it and not do what they're supposed to do. So I think it's really, as a creative person or as someone creating your passionate product, you want to make sure that you're signing the best deal possible. And I totally agree with your biggest mistake is these boilerplate agreements, and we see that not just for licensing. I've had people come up to me, even though I'm very clear about not being an attorney, somebody will hand me an agreement and say, oh, is this a good idea? I found this online. So what I like to do is just open it to the last page, where generally it will be like the choice of law provision will be something like Arkansas. And, we're here in Arizona. And so I just hand it back to the person, usually going, you need to see an attorney. Don't do this. It is like the biggest mistake ever, because you end up with an agreement that's not enforceable. So I think that was a great one. I have one more question here, which is not that question, sorry. Regarding if you have an improper entity, which I believe was business mistake number 2, can you refile correct a company registration if it was incorrectly defaulted to partnership?
Yes, you can, and that's the thing, especially with the limited liability companies or the LLCs. Those are really flexible, and you can change your entity, so you can switch back and forth. It's not that big of a deal, and oftentimes it's actually a really good idea to start out as, let's just say, an LLC, and then usually for me, I use a benchmark around 15 or 20 employees. It makes a lot of sense, and of course it's driven by the bottom line. You're going to want to switch at some point for tax reasons too, to maybe go to a C corporation. Also, I think I could mention here regarding intellectual property, which I didn't yet mention, is there is something called an intellectual property holding company. So your business can, be incorporated as one business, and as you continue to generate intellectual property, you can have another business that is tasked with holding. It's created solely for the purpose of holding that intellectual property, and there are just several advantages to that, both regarding your bottom line and limitation of liability. Just kind of throw that out there at the end.
Yeah, no, great strategy in terms of, if you have a separate company with your IP and then something goes wrong with your operating company, you're not risking your IP. So that is a really interesting story. Thank you for bringing it up. So we're going to wrap it up now by thanking Melissa, and please visit Melissa's website. Oops, I can't. Okay. Sorry, not my computer. You can visit Melissa's website and follow her on Twitter and all that good stuff. So thank you very much, Melissa, and we hope to talk to you soon.
Yep, thank you, Mary. Have a great day.
You too.